Hi, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of ELI on Air. Thanks for taking the time out to join us. ELI on Air is the weekly ELI Talks interactive show where we speak with interesting folks from across the Jewish spectrum about ideas of Jewish engagements, literacy, and identity. My name is Miriam Brousseau, and I am the ELI Talks Program Director, and I am really thrilled to be here today with Rabbi Shai Held of Mechon Hadar in New York, and Rabbi Dan Ain of the 92nd Street Y, and also with Esther Kostanowitz, who is our community manager, is going to be helping us out with the conversation today. And so today we're going to be talking about God and Jewish ideas of God, and how comfortable are we having conversations about the divine? What is the relationship to prayer and to meaning making and all of these interesting things that are on our minds as we approach the high holiday season? And again, throughout this broadcast, we'll be taking your questions live right here through Google+, which you can open up that little box in the lower left-hand corner of the video to share your questions and ideas, and we'll take those live on the air. We'll also be answering your questions over Twitter. Use hashtag ELI Talks, hashtag ELI Talks, and we will take those questions as well. So throughout, please feel free to share your thoughts. And with that, we're going to put Esther behind the scenes to orchestrate those conversations and help us out, and jump right into our conversation with Rabbis Held and Ain. So again, thank you both so much for being here and sharing your time and talent. I think we'll... Thank you. Excellent. I'm really excited about this conversation. Can you start off just this idea that Jews don't talk about God? Is this a false assumption? Where does this idea come from? Why does it persist? Rabbi Held, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I think compared to members of other religious communities, Jews don't talk about God. Or maybe to put it differently, Jews tend to be more reticent than others about speaking about God. And I would suggest at least two reasons for that. One sort of more distant historical and one more recent historical. I don't think these are the only reasons, but I think it might be important ones. One is that if you go back to the beginning of modern times, Jews actually felt that they had more to gain from the possibility of a secular society than anybody else. That is, a society that was not religious was a society that was not Christian. That is, in theory at least, was a society where Jews were not second-class citizens. So in some ways, Jews have always had, in practical terms at least, an investment in creating what people used to call a neutral society, which is close to a secular society in many ways. But I think also we live in a time where, there was a time after the Holocaust where there was a conversation in the Jewish community called post-Holocaust theology, which was not just a chronological designation, that is, thinking that took place after the Holocaust, but it was a kind of conceptual designation. It was Jews grappling with the implications for Judaism, for belief in God, for belief in the chosenness of the Jewish people of the Holocaust. That conversation largely ended, and in recent years I've been thinking, sort of with a great deal of sadness, that the conversation didn't end because people felt like the questions were resolved. The conversation ended because the questions won. For a lot of people, talking about a God, or talking about a God who is, let's call him Judaically recognizable, that is the God of the Bible in some way, became, in the 20th century, extremely difficult and extremely painful. What we have, I think, now, especially among younger Jews, is a real hunger to find either new ways of talking about God or new ways of connecting to traditional ways of talking about God. And I would just add one footnote, and then I'll stop, which is, I think one of the most interesting sociological phenomena among Jews in the late 20th and early 21st century is just how much of the world of Buddhist leadership in America are Jews, right? Many, if not most, of the great Buddhist meditation masters in America are Jews. And I suspect that part of that is that what happened to large swaths of the American Jewish community is their spiritual hungers were there. And Buddhism provided a way of going around, if you prefer, you can say evading, avoiding, but getting around the God question. certainly in American forms of Buddhism, there's somewhere between very little and no God talk. So it's not a coincidence that you have people named Cornfield, Boorstein, and Epstein, who are all the leading Buddhist meditation teachers in America. Something very interesting is going on there.
No, I think that's a good point. I think that's exactly right. I mean, what I'm seeing now, and especially what Rabbi Hell just referred to, is you have a large swath of people for whom the fundamentalist position, which is we know exactly what the divine will has to say and precisely how you should act from the moment you wake up in the morning to how you should, what should be the way you go to sleep, is too literal in interpretation of what it is that God expects from us. And a lot of people say, how could you possibly know that? How could you know that those words exactly mean what you think that they mean? And so they reject that out of hand because it implies a certain lack of humility with regard to our own capabilities to understand what God wants from us. And then you have the other side of the spectrum, which says, you know, whatever you think, that's fine. That's Jewish too. Go right ahead. And people reject that because it provides nothing, and it's self-serving. I think there's a real need, and Shai picked up on this, of people to seek out spirituality, to speak out meaningful connections that are honest, that are real, and that speak to their own circumstances and situations. It's unfortunate, for whatever reason, that the Jewish community or Jewish organizations have this perception as not being able to serve those needs. So, for example, I was just thinking, what do we read during this month? We read, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers come upon me to eat up my flesh, even my adversaries and my foes, they stumble and fall. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I might dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life." It's beautiful, and we read that every day during the month of Elul. And can we recapture that? Can we get a sense of what it means to actually dwell in the house of the Lord? And can we mean what we say in a way that's not dishonest, that doesn't that also maintains a certain amount of humility with regard to how we can convey what it means to live a world with holiness and with godliness? That's the challenge, and it requires some nuance. It doesn't have easy answers. It's not something that you can codify or put in a if you can put in a denomination or a movement and say this is precisely the only way to go about doing it. I think people think that that's not necessarily intellectually honest or doesn't resonate with who they are and the experiences that they have. I mean, there's some moments, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, there's some times when we really connect to an Orthodox reading, there's sometimes when we connect to a Reconstructionist reading, there's sometimes when we connect to a Chabad reading or a Hasidic reading, and there's an ebb and flow to our daily lives, and always having to fit into one particular box, people reject, and having a malleability with the moments when we can actually feel God and bring God into our lives, and the moments in which we can recite other psalms which have definitely other perceptions of who God is. That, I think, is the challenge, and that requires a lot of work and a lot of flexibility and doesn't fit neatly into a box.
So I just want to acknowledge that we've had several people join us recently, and I want to remind you all that we are taking your questions live on the air, so feel free to submit them right here through Google Plus or on Twitter using hashtag ELI Talks. So with that, Rabbi Ain, you recited a psalm beautifully for us, and I just want to tap into this connection between God and talking about God and connecting to God and text, and the God of the Torah versus the God that maybe a lot of especially young Jews today want to connect to. Could you just speak a little bit about the relationship between God and text?
Well, I think texts can sometimes be a real blessing, and at other points can be a real hindrance. I mean, so there are definitely different perceptions of who that God is, who the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, and how the different prophets and rabbis have gone about expressing who that God is. And some of those, I'm in talking with a lot of people, I talk a lot about God, and I'm pretty open about my faith and the way that God has really impacted my life in a beautiful way. And I have tried to share that, and in some cases, as the folks at ELI Talks know, unsuccessfully. And that figuring out why that is, I think a lot of that has to do with trigger words. I think there are trigger words and trigger concepts that people have heard that have been used in contexts that have been exploitive, that have been unhelpful, and that bring up powerful and unfortunate memories for people that drive them away from any God talk whatsoever. There's an expression in Latin which is corruptio optimi pessima, which is the corruption of the best is the worst. And I think, unfortunately, we have real human beings who have functioned as rabbis and as leaders who have exploited texts and who have, unfortunately, the type of religion, the environment that I grew up with, wasn't necessarily connecting and resonant to my generation. It was more of a, as Rabbi Held referred to earlier, more of a perhaps a post-Holocaust baby boomer connection to what God can be. The story I like to tell is when I was at JTS at the seminary, Rabbi Morris Shapiro, of blessed memory, was teaching Talmud at the end of his life in the Beit Midrash. And he was one of the last surviving students in the Lublin Yeshiva. He survived the Shoah. He moved to America 55 years as a rabbi. And I said, after what you experienced, why do it? Why live your life in this fashion? And he said, Judaism rests on three things: God, Torah, and Israel. He said, I love Torah, I love texts, I love teaching. He says, I love the people of Israel, I love being in community. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. And so there was this idea that we could somehow make it work as a people with only community and only texts, do it on our own. And I think that was not connecting with me, and it did not connect with a lot of the folks that Shai had mentioned often seek other alternative, new religious movements. Buddhism, alternative aspects of spirituality have been flooded with Jews over the years for precisely that reason.
I would add, Miriam, if I could,
Sure.
that I think something that's really interesting about American Jewish kind of sociology has been that we have, for a couple of generations now, treated Judaism as a religion for children, right? That is to say, you go to Hebrew school, most often unhappily, until you're old enough to have a bar mitzvah, which ironically, instead of being a moment of entering into the covenant, is usually the moment of checking out. And then you're checked out until you too have children who you put through some version of that same experience. Now, it's perhaps a different conversation to talk about what that has meant for children. But one of the things it has certainly meant for adults is that you have someone, some of the people I interact with here in New York City, right? He has a PhD in physics, thinks about science in the most advanced way, but when it comes to actually thinking about Judaism, has no education past what is suitable for a 12-year-old. And so when we ask ourselves, why does that person find Judaism barren or sterile? Well, wouldn't you? If you were forced to do math at the level of a 12-year-old for the rest of your life, right? If you were forced to speak French at the level of a second-year French student, and you could never read Camus or Sartre, what would happen? And so there's something very profound there, which is why I think the whole project of family education in Judaism, to the extent that it will ever really take hold, is so fundamental, because until that happens, we are all mired in a fundamentally pediatric Judaism, and that's not a tenable model. It means that adults don't know to take Judaism seriously.
Well, that's 100% correct. I was actually watching an interview with Ira Glass. I'm not sure if you know who Ira Glass is. He runs a podcast called This American Life, and he was talking about his own belief system, and he was saying that around the age of 15 or 16, it occurred to him that there was no God, and that he actually was an atheist. And I thought to myself, I don't still maintain the beliefs that I had when I was 15 or 16, right? I've reevaluated those positions, but we come up with these. He decided at 16 he was an atheist, and by golly, he's going to stay an atheist. He's not going to reconsider that or reevaluate that. That is another form of exactly what Shai is talking about. And can we achieve what I like to say? Can we try to pursue a mature Judaism, a Judaism for adults? A Judaism that asks hard questions, that's with, perhaps maybe a little bit more honest with regard to the presence of God in our lives and how we bring God into our homes, into our relationships, to our families. That requires work, requires effort. It's not something that you can really soft sell. And to tap on to what Shai was saying, one of the issues is, I don't know how many of you were on Facebook, but when Robin Williams passed away, the Facebook was flooded with eulogies and memories, and his famous clips and his favorite people have put their favorite quotes on there. And somebody that I was talking to said, there's so much other stuff going on in this world. What, I don't understand all the obsession with Robin Williams. Nobody, didn't know him personally. And my response was, well, they knew him probably better than most of the people that they spend their lives with every day. They probably know him better than the people that you see on the street, than you take the subway with every day, than some of your next door neighbors. They had a deep, powerful relationship with that, with his movies and with some of his jokes, and much more so than we know the other people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that was sort of an eye-opening moment for me, because I've been trying to get people to understand who God is and bring God into that space, but God is such an abstract other. It's really hard to get there if you don't even know who the others who you're spending most of your day with. And so what we've discussed previously, Shai and I and Miriam, is that idea when you can meet people, when you can interact with another human being, when you can see who they are, when you can get into engaging them in a conversation where they might not agree with you, you might not even like them, but if you can get to know who they are, eventually, ultimately, you might have a better concept of what their means to be the ultimate other, and that's God.
Miriam, earlier on, you asked Rabbi Ain a question I thought was interesting that I wanted to not lose about the relationship between Jewish texts and talking about God. And I think that there is something very interesting that happens in the course of the Bible itself. That is that in the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus, twice there appears the notion of lidrosh et Hashem, to seek out God. That is, people in moments of crisis ask God directly for assistance. You have that with the biblical character of Rebecca, and then again Moses explaining himself to Jethro. By the time of the book of Ezra, something fascinating has happened. The word lidrosh, to seek out, no longer modifies Hashem, God, but rather modifies Torat Hashem, God's teaching. You go from, in the Bible itself, the notion of seeking out wisdom from God to seeking out wisdom from the teachings of God. That is, I think you could say, a profoundly beautiful and also totally risky move that lies at the heart of Jewish piety. That is, the notion that Torah is supposed to mediate the will of God. One of the things that makes so powerful for us, I think, is that in a way it makes God portable and indirectly, at least, always available. The negative side is it becomes very easy for those texts no longer to mediate God, but to replace God. And one of the many potential and potentially very negative consequences of that is you end up having a hyper-intellectualist culture that doesn't know how to talk about emotions, that doesn't know how to talk about matters of the spirit, and in the end runs the risk of forgetting that it's actually all in the service of something greater and transcendent. I mean, there's a lot we could try to unpack there, but there is something very profound there and very, very fundamental, I think, about what Judaism's longing is, a text-mediated conversation with God, and what its risk is, a text culture that loses God and ends up focusing only or almost exclusively on that which is intended to mediate God.
So we had a, maybe this is a related question. I have so many spinning in my head as we have this conversation. So a question came in from Alan. You mentioned that our beliefs evolve as we mature, at least in an ideal situation. Does our God evolve too?
Dan, do you want to take that first, or?
Does our God evolve? I don't know if God evolves. God is who God is, as our tradition teaches. But I think as there are different moments in our lives when we come to appreciate the different ways in which God is present, or the way in which we don't feel God present. There are certain philosophical systems that we can get into with regard to theology and how we understand God and God's involvement. But to relate back to Shai's point, I think this hyper-intellectualized understanding, and a lot of people want to come to a surface and understand who God is and wrap their minds around that. Well, there's an old Hasidic feeling like a God who you can wrap your mind around is certainly not a very powerful God indeed. As I like to say, a God who exists only in your head, who you don't share and discuss with other people, is a very puny God. And so I think as we evolve and as we understand, there are different moments, different depths that we can take it to. And now when you think about Judaism, right, so what do you hear all the time? What, Jews have how many Nobel Prize, right? How many Jews have won Nobel laureates? How many Jews have won whatever scientific math awards? We take a lot of pride in that. We take a lot of pride in our intellect and our basic understanding. And when you think about what God is in different aspects, yes, certainly we can find God, or at least attempt to, through logical, rational experiences when we're in that mindset. But there are also moments in which our hearts have been broken, in which reason is not present, in which we can feel the God's presence in our lives. So, being open to how we evolve, how we change. Certainly, for example, my wife, God willing, is due to give birth any day now. Will be my second child. My perception of who God was before becoming a father changed to after the moment when I became a father and then began to bless my own child. And God willing, my own children. So there's definitely an evolutionary process with how we go about thinking about God and the ways in which God comes into our lives. Does that mean God changes? You could read, Malachi 3:6, which says, "I am the Lord, I change not." I mean, I don't know how you want to understand that, but I do think that there are different ways. Some of them intellectually, some of them emotional, and some of them are completely unknown, in which people have sensed and come to understand God at different moments in their lives.
So I would, in a way, take Alan's question from a slightly different angle, if I could, which is, I'm not sure evolve is the language I would use, but I think there's a really interesting tension in Jewish thought, and that tension is between the God of the Bible, on the one hand, and the God who is filtered through philosophy on the other. That is, when you start reading philosophy, you often have the risk of ending up with a God who is essentially Aristotle's God. A first cause, an unmoved mover, an eternally changeless deity, which is very different from a simple reading of the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, which is about a God who is in covenant, a God who is relational, a God about whom Tanakh feels the Hebrew Bible can say over and over again, Vayinachem Hashem, God changed God's mind. So whether or not we want to use the language of evolve, I think there is a really deep tension in the history of Jewish thought between people like Maimonides, who want to talk about an eternally changeless, abstract God, and the God of biblical and rabbinic Judaism, who is fundamentally relational. And being relational means that the future is open. Right? It's one of the most radical claims that the Bible makes about God's relationship with the world is, I don't think the Bible thinks God knows exactly how things are going to unfold tomorrow, because you and I are free to decide. Now, how do we reconcile that with philosophy? That's a conversation for, a 12-week ELI seminar. But I think that tension is very real. The notion that God is so relational that things are unfolding in God's presence, I think is very core to classical Jewish sources.
Yeah, that's a great point about free will that I think we often lose sight of when you think about philosophically where does free will come from, or for a scientific or a materialist perspective. Free will is pretty hard to ascertain, but yet that's what our tradition, that's what Moshe, that's what Moses pretty much said. It's our choice, right? Choose life. You can put before you good and evil. Choose life, and there's that idea that when we make decisions, when we decide how we want to treat another person, how do we want to look at someone who is we're walking by on the street, or someone who is asking us for money or for food on a subway, how are we going to treat that person? How are we going to go about treating our neighbors? How are we going to, maybe treat someone just who is sick? Are we going to visit someone? Are there basic acts of chesed? God, our tradition tells us, cares about those decisions that we make, cares about how we interact with those people, cares on an intimate, personal level. And when you start talking about personal notions of God, that's scary to a lot of people. That's scary to imagine that there is that sort of responsibility that is placed upon us. And being open to that, being open to the fact that there is a choice that we have to make in every way that we go about living our lives is part of having a mature understanding of what it means to be a Jew.
I think that Dan, your comment actually pulls us to something really fundamental that I think is a very difficult issue in American spirituality, and probably, honestly, in the whole history of religion as well, but it's kind of very obvious in America. And that is ways of talking about spirituality and God that are about filling our needs, serving our needs on the one hand, and ways of talking about God and spirituality on the other that are about teaching us that our needs are not the center of the universe and teaching us to serve ends greater than ourselves. That is, so fundamental. My book on Abraham Joshua Heschel is essentially about this point, right? The aspiration to have a sense of the spiritual life that reminds me that my ego is not the center of the universe. And some of the ways, and I hope this doesn't sound as negative as I mean it to. I think it's a very complicated issue, but the way that in some American popular spirituality, for example, you hear people say things like, go to a yoga class, give yourself a gift. I would prefer, I will sound absurd saying this, if yoga studios would say, go to a yoga class, learn to transcend yourself. Go to a yoga class, learn to be more generous. Because I think that is much more authentic to what traditional religious paths of various kinds are about and what they're for. And it's very hard. Religion as a way of just making me feel better about myself, I am decidedly not saying there is not a place for that at moments, for sure. But a religion that is just about that, as opposed to a religion that basically says to me, love more, be kinder, pursue justice more deeply. That's a religion that is very compelling and also quite frightening for a lot of us, as Dan just said. There's a lot to unpack there.
I want to touch on this idea of the language that we use to talk about God. I've heard you both use the term Hashem, which is very, which means the name, literally, and is a way of referring to the tetragrammaton, right, the four-letter name for God that we read in almost every single prayer. You've both sort of discussed this idea of intimacy and of having sort of a personal connection with God, and I'm wondering to what extent you feel language can facilitate or hinder that kind of connection.
Well, there are two aspects that we can approach this. One is through the question that you asked previously about texts and how do you grapple with texts and with language that are problematic with regard to that. And I think sometimes it's powerful if you get together 10 people and you're sitting around in a class and you're all coming together around a text. Even if that is problematic, it still provides that this is our text, this is our Torah, and we're going to try to unpack it and sort of offloading our own, needs, our own sensibilities in order to get at what this text has to say can be a pretty powerful thing. I also think that, let me give you a couple of examples. Been talking to a few people, I would say they're in their mid-20s, and they're dealing with their own personal issues and whatnot, and one of the things I'll say to them is, well, have you prayed? And they'll look at me, like I have two heads, right? No one has, they say, I haven't heard anyone mention the word prayer for a decade. No one even discusses the language of prayer. And I said, well, why don't you try to find a space in your apartment somewhere when the lights are out, after everyone has gone to sleep, where you actually open up yourselves to begin to pray for yourself. Now, it's hard to even think about praying for yourself. Sometimes it's a lot easier to pray for something abstract, or pray for something unknown, or pray for somebody else. But to actually say, hey, I'm going to begin to pray for this. I'm going to open up my heart. The language is not even necessarily going to be mediated through the language of our liturgy, but it's going to be what just flows out of me at that particular moment. That, and then I say to them, and now if you can do that, imagine that there actually is somebody listening. And that, for people, they haven't, that is not something that we emphasize at all. Usually people think, oh, if I'm going to say a prayer, I have to say the Shema, or I have to say the Amidah, or I have to do it this particular way, and I don't have the Jewish knowledge to be able to get into it. Providing people with the flexibility not only to use the text in public settings to break it down and to get into it and say this is our source text, this is something, this is the tree of life, Torah, that we're going to figure out what to mean, but also to have these own moments of personal inspiration and prayerfulness is something foreign to a lot of people, especially in the next generation. And figuring out how to open that up and to do that in powerful ways can reformulate the way that we go about thinking this world, what we value, how we come to understand ourselves, and what we think our purpose might be.
I would just add a kind of again, from a slightly different angle. The question about language is really interesting because I think Jewish culture has a kind of dialectical or back and forth relationship with language. On the one hand, Jews make this startlingly audacious claim that language is so powerful that it is the very tool that God uses to create the world and confer blessing upon it. I mean, language makes everything, right? Words create worlds, as Heschel said, which is, I think, his translation of the phrase, Baruch she'amar, right? Blessed is the one who spoke and the world came into being. On the other hand, Judaism is keenly aware of the total limits and failure of language when it comes to talking about that which is transcendent and beyond language. And so there's this like almost delicious paradox of talking about that which can't be talked about. That's what we do. That's on some level what theology is. That's very powerful, and it also raises difficult questions for us, right? These questions go back the whole history of philosophy. You know, to what extent do we use words literally when we talk about God? And if we use language metaphorically, what do we mean by that? Does that mean that we are describing God, but we're describing God inadequately? Does it mean, as some, I think, very unconvincing modern philosophers think, right? We're just talking about our perceptions. We're not really talking about anything outside of ourselves. I find that to be philosophically problematic and also spiritually very problematic. But the tension around language really lies at the heart of Jewish spirituality. I mean, right? The notion that God created the world out of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, that is so fundamental in Kabbalah, right? That is about a culture that is obsessed with words, right? And yet, you know, what does Maimonides tell us? That the highest form of prayer is contemplative silence. Because embracing that, I think, is really fundamental. And not needing to resolve it, right? Sometimes people have a tendency to take dialectics or back and forth motions and want to push them to the point of saying, well, which is really right? The answer is, I think, yes, right? We move back and forth between those things, and that's the best we got.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's, even within that tension, the way we sort of use that language to either unify or diversify God and to pull into certain aspects of God's self when the time or the maturation is appropriate for that. Can you say a little bit more about God language in particular? Sort of the words that we use. I mean, we're saying the word God, right? What does that actually mean? What are some of the other terms that we use, and what do they imply?
Well, one thing, to go back to something you asked about before, about the word Hashem, or the four-letter name of God, one thing that I think is at stake in the use of those terms is that there's a very radical claim in the four-letter name of God, which is that God has a proper name, which is another way of saying that God is a subject, not an idea, right? An idea doesn't have a proper name, right? At the risk of sounding absurd for a second, you wouldn't name an idea Jim. You would name a subject Jim. And with all the appropriate caveats here, giving God a name, addressing God by name, is a way of talking about a God who is relational. God, many of us, including me, use this word differently, but God, in theory, the word God, is more generic, right? Hashem is the God who is revealed in Torah and has a relationship with the Jewish people. God, right, is more abstract than that. Perhaps you could say more universal, more distant, more purely transcendent. Again, I'm not talking about necessarily the way many people have turned the English word God into a proper name. But at least theoretically, that's part of what's at stake there. Now, in terms of the complexity of God talk, there is a debate in the history of philosophy that, as with many debates in the history of philosophy, if you just sort of say them in normal English, you realize it's something that we all actually think about. It doesn't have to be the province of 12 people. And that is, and I sort of alluded to this before, but the moment I say that my language for God does not adequately or fully accurately capture God, what are the implications of that for what I'm doing when I talk about God? Does it mean, again, as some liberal strands of theology in the modern period have started to say, well, I'm really just talking about my own religious experiences, or does it mean that I'm embracing, that I am talking about something transcendent and beyond myself, but that at some level all I can do is stammer. I personally find that latter position much more, I think it's much truer to the history of religion, much more compelling, and in an odd way, much more humble. Because I'm groping for something beyond myself and also recognizing and affirming how utterly transcendent of my understanding and my capacity it is. And really embracing living in that chasm of striving for relationship with something that I don't fully understand. I could say much more about this, but I want to give Dan a chance to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right on point, especially when we're talking about language and we're talking about text. It's often, this idea that we know exactly what these texts mean, we know exactly how they should be read. Usually it's through the power of poets and poetry and additional language that have a way of opening up the text to spin it on its head, to perceive it in a way that we never might have thought it before. I mean, we have the high holidays coming up, so I'm thinking of the Yehuda Amichai poem on the real hero of the story of the Akedah, where he creates this wonderful poem, and he has the real hero of the story of the Akedah is actually the ram. And it's a way of opening up that text and reinterpreting and reimagining it through the power of language that creates different avenues to understand what the particular texts mean. I think the frustration with when we talk about trigger words, when we talk about people feeling alienated from God, is the perception that we can know exactly what this text means. Well, that creates a very flat interpretation of the text. And if we perceive God as being much larger than any one particular interpretation, then we have to be, just like Shai said, humble with regard to our ability to interpret it. I mean, I think in some ways that's why Moses, there's only one characterological description of Moses that we find in our Torah. Moses is described as the most humble of all people. Now, he's not the bravest, he's not the wisest, he's described as the most humble. Well, why would you have Moses be the most humble? My take on it is, if you're having the person come down with 10 commandments, with the God's will, well, that person who is the lawgiver has to maintain a real powerful humility with regard to his ability to ascertain what that divine will really is. And I think that's a very powerful lesson for us. And through the power of language, through the power of nuance and poetry, we're able to reinterpret what it is that God wants from us in many different ways. And that's a process that continues to evolve and really marks what it means to be a Jew.
So if I could, I would like to just sort of spin that out a little further, because I think that one of the most important things for religious people to be able to do is to admit that we live in a religiously ambiguous universe. That is to say, it is very common for religious people of various stripes to have a posture of basically condescension to non-believers, right? That is to say, I know the truth, and my goal is to impart it to you. And I'm not saying there's no room for some version of that, but I think it's also extremely important, where humility is concerned, to be able to acknowledge, you know what, there are a lot of good reasons not to believe. There are a lot of good reasons to think, what, a God who cares about us? Are you insane to affirm such a thing? And I think that what happens when you're able to make space for that is the kinds of conversations people can have where they're not always only preaching, but sometimes actually learning from each other and curious about each other, is incredibly congenial, not just for the well-being of the human race, but also for our own humility, for acknowledging how much we don't know, for actually being able to say how much of faith is a risk, and I might be wrong, right? It was Kierkegaard who taught us that most powerfully, right? We don't know the things we want to know, right? Someone posed that as a question, right? Why is it so hard for us? Why is it so hard for us to acknowledge we don't know the things we want to know? You know, certainty is very important in some parts of our life, but the quest for certainty can be idolatrous also. And faith on some level, you know, my teacher, Rabbi Greenberg, I once heard him say one of the most extraordinary sentences I have ever heard. It has stayed with me and shaped my life in countless ways. Through this, he says so many great things like this that he probably forgot it, but it totally changed my life. I heard him say once in a public lecture, probably almost 30 years ago, the difference between an atheist and a theist is not how much, but how often. Right? The difference between an atheist and a theist is not how much, but how often. By which he meant, I think, look, everyone who's sane, everyone who walks down the street of Manhattan has to have moments where they say, really? A universe created by a good God where each of us is valued? I'm sorry, but that's just madness. And once you've had moments like that, your whole way of relating to the world, to other people, to your own faith, your willingness to do violence to other people in the name of your faith, all of it becomes problematized and complicated. Now, one last point about that. I don't think that has to mean that your faith dissipates or becomes weaker. What it becomes is more complicated, more dialectical, more spacious, more humble, and more able to make space for other people and to admit its own limitations.
Mm-hmm. So in our last, there's so many directions we could go, and there's so much richness here, but we have about 5 minutes left. And I actually want to touch on another piece of Gina's question that she asked earlier on. If so many of us are stunted to some extent in our Jewish learning, in our understanding of God, is that maybe an opportunity for this kind of humility? And on top of that, what are some of the things that you, as teachers and leaders of community and very knowledgeable people in Jewish thought and text and practice and all of these things, what are some of the things that we should be doing or thinking about in order to help mature that understanding going forward?
Well, I mean, I think Gina raises a good question, and how do we go about sharing that with people is something that, especially as we gear up for the high holidays, I know I'm thinking about, and I know Shai is thinking about, which is how do we begin to share meaningful experiences. One of the things that I guess had frustrated me, right, so I ended up becoming a rabbi after 9/11. I was an attorney, and I, like many of other people in my generation, showed up at high holiday services after September 11th, really looking for meaning. And I was blown away by all the other people in my generation who showed up there. Two people who had already disregarded religion and Judaism as having anything to do in their lives. And unfortunately, you know, I guess what I at that moment decided to do was to pursue a career as a rabbi, because I wanted to find a way to reinterpret the best of our tradition in a way that connects to this generation that is looking for spirituality, that is looking for meaning. I think what you see is moments in our lives when we're looking for meaning and when we're not present and we don't just show up. And the opportunity to be present on the high holidays, to hear those prayers, can be very powerful and enlightening for people, just to show up and just to walk in the door. And what I have been noticing and I've been thinking is that it's not necessary, and I think sometimes in liberal congregations and communities we go out of our way to try to appeal to, try to be smart. Right? I mean, you see this all the time from rabbis and from leaders and from preachers. You want to be smart, you want to have the right article, you want to have the right point, you want to tickle people's intellect and to get them to conceive of God in a certain way so that they go home. And it's very rare that in people's lives people come to an intellectual understanding and say, aha, now I've found God because I've intellectually figured it out. It's not. I've never experienced. I haven't experienced that in my own lives, and it's very rare that you experience that for other people. And I think what people respond to and can lead to a mature understanding of what God is by seeing someone who is dedicating their lives to God, who believes in God, who is walking the walk, who is showing up, and is willing to enter into that unknown and believe it. Instead of necessarily trying to meet people where they are. And that's the powerful balance. Now, even if people disagree with me, right, so often people come to my services and say, Rabbi, you talk about God, I don't like that language. Rabbi, you want me to pray, I'm not interested in praying. I don't believe, I just like the music, I just like the good stuff. You hear that all the time, but I find that for a lot of people who are showing up at those services, they will look to someone who will express an opinion about there being holiness in this world, and take it seriously, and take it as they're willing to devote their lives to it. And often, you know, for whatever reason, that wasn't necessarily the experience that I had growing up. And then I think in my rabbinate, I know in Shai's and a lot of other good rabbis here who are going out and trying to meet what I think is a spiritual crisis that a lot of the people in my generation and the generation younger than me are experiencing is, can we go out, can we meet them, can we wear our hearts on our sleeves, can we make mistakes, can we be wrong, can we be humble, but can we also do it with the sense that there is a God in this world, that God is real and has been a power in our lives and can be a power for them.
Rabbi Hal?
So, it's interesting that when Gina asked the question, I was reminded of something that the Christian mystic Thomas Merton says. I hope I'm remembering this right. He says something like, after years and years of prayer, I came to realize that all we can ever be is beginners. And I think there's something enormously powerful about that. As someone who teaches Torah on a daily basis, I think about that all the time, about the ways in which being a beginner can be exhilarating, or having the posture of a beginner. That is what Buddhists call beginner's mind, a sense of just total openness, of the sort of ability to be radically surprised by the world, by God, by text, by ideas, by people. But I would add something else that I've really been struggling for a way to talk about with a lot of people, which is one of the things that it means to be a beginner is to want to work hard to grow. And I worry sometimes that Americans very often, I mean, obviously I'm speaking in very broad terms, and I don't mean to be overly sweeping here, but I think that we have failed a generation or more of American Jews by not pushing them, right? No one assumes that I can understand the Higgs boson by reading an article in the New York Times. No one imagines that I can read a French novel by spending 12 minutes on French. And yet there's a certain hunger for, yes, I really want to have some enormously compelling connection to Judaism, in a 15-minute fix. And it actually takes work. It takes discipline. It's like any other intellectual or spiritual discipline, and Judaism is on some level both, right? So being a beginner is exhilarating. So on some level, we should all remind ourselves that we are always beginners. And yet being a beginner, if we want to grow, comes with responsibilities and challenges. What am I willing to do in order to grow in Torah, to grow in Judaism, to grow in kindness, to grow in the ability to be present with people in moments of vulnerability in their lives? What am I willing to grow in understanding Jewish texts? What am I willing to do as a beginner? I think it would be helpful for us if we took the shame out of being a beginner and actually embraced it as a value, but not the value of, okay, it doesn't matter whether I know anything, but the value of I should always be learning and growing and striving, because that's what beginners do.
I think with that, we can go into the new beginning of Rosh Hashanah and the new year, thinking of ourselves as beginners, or at least I hope that's part of what we're all walking away with from this conversation. Huge thank you to both Rabbi Held and Rabbi Ain for sharing your time and your wisdom. Always a pleasure to learn with you both. And I thank you to all of our viewers who submitted questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. It was such a rich conversation. We're happy to continue that conversation online. There's an ELI on Air Facebook group that you're welcome to join. And feel free to get in touch with these guys and continue learning from them at the 92Y or at Mechon Hadar, and in any other setting that you find. It's a great time to get started. Next week we will be joined by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who gave a beautiful ELI talk about parenting as a spiritual practice. And I think it will be a nice continuation of this very conversation as we continue through the month of Elul and the high holiday season. So we'll hope to see you next week on air. Thank you again to Rabbi Held, to Rabbi Ain, and to Esther, who's been working hard behind the scenes, keeping the conversation going. And take care, everybody. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.